Hello, this is a video for Unit 5 to review for your Biology 30 final exam. I've done it in the same form as Unit 4. Some questions to think about. This is not a comprehensive review of the unit, but just some questions to maybe jog your memory or say, oh, I've studied this or I haven't. If you can answer all of these questions, you're in pretty good shape. So one question here I have up at the top, different forms of the same gene. This should be a really quick and easy one for you to answer. Different forms of the same gene are called alleles. And when we're talking about alleles, usually there's a dominant and a recessive, and usually for the dominant, we write a capital letter, and the recessive, we write a lowercase letter. If we have two dominant ones, we could call that homozygous dominant. Two recessive alleles, we would call that homozygous recessive. And if there was a mix, we would call that heterozygous. For Mendelian inheritance, we know that we've got rules that we follow, right? If we're talking about just dominant and recessive, if we're talking about the ones that are easily solved with Punnett squares, then we know we're talking about just dominant and recessive. We know they're following the rules, the Mendel's law of independent assortment and law of segregation. But not every gene works that way. And here, if we have a color gene, and that color gene is notated by the letter C for color, and a B for maybe blue, and a Y for yellow. If there is complete dominance, so this is Mendelian, this one would be Mendelian. We have blue and yellow, and if we have a mix of the two, one allele for blue and one for yellow, we get blue. So that means blue is dominant, yellow is recessive. So this would be Mendelian. Other forms of non-Mendelian genetics included codominance, where blue and yellow showed up as both blue and yellow. And we saw that with examples like a roan horse, where like both the black and the white hairs would grow and it would kind of look blue for some reason. Incomplete dominance we saw in our notes or in some problems with looking at flowers, red and white flowers coming together to make green. That's the wrong color. Pink. Red and white make pink. In this picture, we have blue and yellow making green. I'm awake. So blue and yellow making green, but the green is not a separate allele. It's both the blue and the yellow blended together. So if we had a blue and a yellow, so that's green, to mate with another green, we would have half of them show up green, a quarter of them show up blue, and a quarter of them show up yellow if we do our Punnett square. There were other forms of non-Mendelian inheritance to remember about, like epistasis and polygenic traits. Polygenic traits were the ones where more than one gene contributed to the phenotype. We looked at, I think, height as one of those, or maybe like size of a corn cob, I think is maybe in your textbook. Let's look at some more questions over here, though. So in a pedigree, remember this was the unit where we did pedigrees. Which individuals are most easily determined to be homozygotic? It's usually a puzzle when you're doing a pedigree, and it helps if there's something that's easy to point out. And the ones that are homozygotic mean they have the same, like either it's big B, or little b, or whatever letter, but my capital and lowercase b's are at least easy to tell apart from each other. So homozygotic means same, both homozygotic dominant or homozygotic recessive. And if this is a Mendelian tree, which they will all be for you, then the ones that are easiest to find are the ones that are homozygotic recessive. That would be like little b, or like in this case, yellow and yellow. Or if blood types, it would be blood type O and blood type O. For recessive traits, we know that they only show up when. So they're only notated, they're only shaded in or not shaded in on your pedigree when both copies are the recessive. With a dominant recessive one, both this and this, come on here, would be the same, whereas this would show up different. So this one is always going to be unique, this one is always going to be unique, and it's going to be easier to spot. So when you're filling out a pedigree, that's a good place to start. Here we have some more questions about modes of inheritance, which is a good thing to remember about. If the allele is on the X or the Y chromosome, then we know that the mode of inheritance is, well, we have two possible choices, right? Autosomal or sex-linked. And if it's on the X or the Y chromosome, hey, highlight, there we go, then that's sex-linked. If it was on any other chromosome, so chromosome 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, or any one that's not named X or Y, then it would be autosomal. If the condition is caused by the dominant allele, then we would call it dominant. And if it was from the recessive allele, we would call it recessive. So there's two things we can talk about, whether they are dominant or recessive, and whether they are autosomal and sex-linked. And anything could be a combination of any one of those. In dominant traits, we mostly see this happen in every generation. We don't see skipping. For autosomal ones, both men and women are affected equally, more or less. For sex-linked traits, we see mostly females having that trait and fewer males. As far as recessive traits, the autosomal ones affect men and women equally. But since the trait skips generations, when you work through your Punnett squares for it, you'll find that mostly males will have that trait. So as an example question, maybe for an X-linked recessive trait, a son born to a woman with that trait. So she would have 2 X chromosomes, and both of them, maybe I'll do B, little b. I don't know what B stands for in this entire video, but little b means recessive. She has 2 X chromosomes, and they're both recessive because she has that trait. She is affected. The father would have something. We don't know what his X chromosome says. We don't know his other one is a Y. So if we are breeding these two together, and we have the mother and we have the father, which we don't know his X chromosome, we do know that these two down here, the two male options, have only one copy of the X chromosome, and that has the recessive trait, the recessive allele. So in this case, for sure, if the mother is affected and it's a X-linked recessive trait, then the son will be affected for sure. The daughter, we don't know. We would have to know about the father. We'd have to know what his version of the X allele was. Is it the dominant one or the recessive one? What are the odds for the daughter? We don't know unless we know about the father's X chromosome. So it could be that he has the recessive allele, in which case she would also be affected 100% of the time, or it could be that he has a dominant allele and she would never be affected, but would be a carrier. If this were a dominant trait, so if this were an X-linked dominant trait, then would that affect both genders equally? Take a minute, maybe pause the video and check. So would that affect both genders equally? Here, if we have the mother, and we don't know for sure what her second X chromosome would be, and for the father, we don't know what his are, and we do a Punnett square, we know that at least some of the time so this one over here, because we don't know her other allele, or maybe we do, at least some of the time, both daughters and sons can be affected. So would that affect both genders equally? It should, but we don't know that for sure. If it's X-linked and dominant, chances are, just like statistically speaking, that females will be affected more, but both could be affected. It's not such a clear-cut answer as our last one. We're going to look at this pedigree here in a moment, but first, if a trait affects one child, but neither of the parents are affected, what are the genotypes of those parents? This seems like not enough information, but it is. So if a trait affects one child, but neither of the parents are affected, this has to be a recessive trait. And both parents have to have, it's not with the X's and Y's, this could be autosomal too. So let's say this is for color, I don't know, or for just anything. Here's big B, little b, big B, little b. And we've got the two parents here breeding. We have the outcome that we have 3 of the 4 possibilities showing up as the dominant phenotype and 1/4 of them showing up as the recessive phenotype. If either of the parents were affected, they would have a homozygous trait. They would have homozygous alleles, and we wouldn't see this case where neither of the parents are affected. So for them both to not be affected, but for the child to be affected, it has to be a recessive trait, and both of these have to be heterozygotic. They have to be heterozygotes. They have to have a mix of both the dominant and both parents have to have the dominant and the recessive allele. Just some quick matching here. Individuals' combination of alleles for a given trait, that is their, maybe pause and do this yourself, but that is their genotype. 2 alleles from one gene separate independently from the alleles for another gene during meiosis. This is one of Mendel's laws, and it's the law of segregation. An unknown genotype, need to spell more carefully, crossed with the homozygous recessive genotype. This is a test cross to figure out what the other unknown genotype is, because if we know that it's breeding with homozygous recessive, it can tell us a lot about what the other pair is. Different forms of a gene are just called alleles. The observable trait or effect of a given genotype is called the phenotype. And there's one left over, so each gamete receives only one copy of a gene that's distributed randomly. That's the law of independent assortment. There's one more thing that I wanted to do here in Unit 5, which was to take a look at this pedigree. It says it's for an autosomal recessive trait. Fill in as many genotypes as possible. So I'm going to use B's like we've been doing before. If it's autosomal recessive, we know that everybody who's affected has little b, little b. And there's no reason I've been using B in this video. I just picked a letter and stuck with it. For everybody else, we're not so sure. For this person here, we know for sure they have at least one big B, but we don't know about the other letter. If we look at their offspring, they've got 2 who are affected and 1 who is not. Well, we know for sure that if they had big B, then all of the offspring would inherit at least one big B. Since 2 of them inherited 2 little b's, the second little b had to have come from the father here. So now we've got this. Here this person's unaffected, so big B, but from their mother they can only get a little b, so they get the recessive allele from the mom. So we've got these parents, these grandparents, I guess, and their kids figured out. For this person here, this whole family we figured out because they're all affected. It's all autosomal recessive. We're good. For here, this father, individual 2-1, we know has at least one big B, but nothing else yet. We know that all 3 of their kids have at least one big B, but we don't know much else. Do we? What do they get from their mom? Every one of them has to get a little b from their mom because that's all she has to give. So we know all 3 of this son and daughter and the other son, we know they have to be heterozygotic. We don't know for sure about this person's genotype. Chances are that since the big B went to every one of their kids, that they're homozygous dominant, but we don't know that for sure. It could have been that they're heterozygotic and that this one just happened to be the one that these 3 sperm passed down. We don't know that. So there's one person here we're not too sure about, but everybody else we could fill in. And this is really good practice for Unit 5 as you're studying for the final, to do pedigrees. They have everything all together. That is my big recommendation for studying Unit 5. Work in pedigrees, do all your work, show all your work. You will review a lot more at once. I'll come back with another video for Unit 6 to prepare for your final exam.